So it's 7:02. Let's get down to business. What a week. I am here today to talk to you about the plural of moose being moose, and that the Duke's non-super grammaticos, which I'm not going to explain that saying it all. Just understand that it is true. My name is Dan Kinnehild. In the modern world, my name is Claire Knudsen-Latta. And I'm a linguist by training and a giant nerd by passion and avocation. So, plural of moose is moose. Let's get into it. So, before we talk about why the plural of moose is moose, we're going to talk briefly about English. English is a member of the Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family. That's a very, very large family. It stretches from India through Persia to Europe. Lots of languages. We're part of that Germanic branch. Our relations include German, the Scandinavian languages, except Finnish, Dutch, Frisian, Scots, a whole host of other ones that I can't remember off the top of my head. Within that Germanic family, we are part of the Anglo-Frisian subgroup. So that's us, Frisian and Scots, and a language that doesn't exist anymore called Yola. And so then, yes, there's us. English is marked among its many cousins by the frequency and aggressiveness with which it borrows words from other languages. And part of the reason that we do this is because it's incredibly easy to do in modern English. Because modern English is not an inflected language, it has some minor inflecting, but in general, we rely almost entirely on word order to get our point across. So you can take a word from another language and you don't have to make sure that it can be declined or conjugated in our system. You just have to sort of slap a apostrophe S on the end of it to make it possessive, or just an S to make it plural, and you're off to the races. There are some abnormal nouns in English. Moose is one of them, and we're going to talk about why that is here in just a bit. So why do people think moose is meese? And why is goose geese? And I wanted to include this slide because mostly it means I can talk about the Germanic Umlaut, which is one of my favorite things. So Germanic Umlaut takes place about 450, 500 CE. It affects all of the Germanic languages, all the early Germanic languages, with the exception of Gothic. So Gothic does not go through the umlaut process, which is how we can date it so definitively to a roughly 50-year time span when it kicked off. So what's happening is the vowels in the back of the mouth, when they're in a very specific presentation, which is in a syllable that comes immediately before the front vowel E or a glide yi, they move forward in the mouth. So all of you in your own homes, in your spaces, I want you, don't pay attention to the people around you. It doesn't matter. They don't matter. I matter. So back of your mouth, make the sound oh, right? It's all the way in the back of your tongue is all the way to the back of your mouth. It's a nice deep sound, oh, and then sort of change your tongue as you come forward. Oh, right? So the middle of the word boat, oat, right? That's a shift as you move the sort of the tongue from the back of your mouth to the front of your mouth. You're not touching anything. That's the hallmark of a vowel, is you're not touching the rest of your mouth with your tongue. It's unimpeded, but you're moving it forward. So that's what we mean when we're talking about a back vowel through a mid vowel to a front vowel. And then we talk about high and low vowels. So if you make those sound your tongue is near the bottom of your mouth. If you make the sound e, your tongue is near the top of your mouth. So that's a low and a high. It's also got to do with the shape of your lips. So you can have rounded and unrounded vowels, but that's not important. What is important here is that for Germanic words, and in English, an example here is man, men, e, a, you can feel it move from the back of your mouth to the front. So that is the Germanic umlaut. And that is why there's some words in Germanic languages, in English, for example, like goose, that has a plural, geese. So you're like, I don't think there's an I in geese anywhere. There's not anymore. There used to be. So these examples are mouse and foot. So mouse used to be moose and moosey for the plural. We eventually dropped that I. So you had moose and moose, and then that evolves in through English through its various vowel changes to mouse and mice. Same thing happens with foot. Becomes in the plural. Foot becomes feet. It's very pretty. I love these diagrams. These diagrams please me greatly. I hope they please you. So this isn't a moose. And now we're going to get into why moose is the way it is. So we understand now why goose is the way it is. And so we have a framework for thinking, well, goose takes a certain plural. Why doesn't moose? There were moose in Europe. Why does it not follow the standard Germanic pattern? And that would be because of loanwords and calques. And loanwords and calques. What is a loanword? A loanword is a word that we borrow from another language whole cloth. So, like moose. A calque is a word that we borrow from another language and then translate into the target language. So amusingly, calque itself is a loanword from French, and loanword is a calque of the German Loanword, which means loanword. So we've taken, and it's deeply amusing. So French is all about the calques. You see that all over the place, and it's because of les immortals, which are the members of the Académie Française, and they demand that their language remain pure and perfect and wonderful. And so they just take concepts like offline, and they translate that into French. So you can't say offline, you have to say au long, or you can't say le broadband, you have to say le large bond, or le bond large. I don't actually remember. Le carte mère instead of le motherboard. And then my favorite, personal favorite, is l'objet volant non identifié, OVNI, which is a UFO. So it's an object which is flying and unidentified instead of just saying le UFO. You also see with loanwords and calques, you see the impact of phonotactics. This little bullet is in here specifically so I can talk about phonotactics because I think it's a fascinating thing that brings warmth and joy to my heart. Phonotactics are the rules about how sounds go together. And if you get a really good idea of how phonotactics work in a specific language, you can become the god emperor of hangman. I shit you not. So you can see the example of how phonotactics would impact a loanword or a calque, or specifically impact a calque, by looking, for example, at Arbeit, which is German, and it means to work, or it means he works, I think. And that comes through in Japanese as arubaito, which means afternoon job, or like a side job. Merry Christmas, famously in the Andrews Sisters song, Mele Klikimaka. Here you have a much more limited phonological catalog in Hawaiian, so you can't represent all the sounds of Merry Christmas when you speak Hawaiian, so you have rules about, okay, R's turn into L's, S's turn into K, and then now we have to make sure that there is a vowel with every consonant. So mele instead of Mary, kaliki maka, Christmas. And you can once you understand how those rules are applied, you can back your way into Merry Christmas. I just want to talk about phonotactics. This has little to do with moose. So, turns out species loss can really mess with your language. So if you were thinking earlier, well, moose, there's moose in Scandinavia, clearly the English must have known what a moose is, and why didn't they use a word like moose? Well, they did have what we in American English call moose in Britain, but they were largely dead by the end of the Bronze Age. So by the time that people are immigrating to the Americas, we have a problem. In other Germanic languages, the word for moose is cognate with our word elk. So including British English, which decided to be shirty and call a moose an elk because they just couldn't go with the flow. So they call it an elk, we call it a moose. It's a whole isogloss. These are all related to the Latin alcus. Alcus alcus is the Latin name for the moose, or the biological nomenclature for a moose. And interestingly, alcus may be a borrowing from Proto-Germanic. It's a little unclear because there probably weren't elk in Italy. Anyway, that's something to think about in the future. So anyway, by the time that they're going to the Americas, the Brits are like, cool, elk equals very large deer, and that's all they know. So take a wild guess at what very large deer they met first. Yeah, it was one of these assholes. So they get to the Americas, they encounter this fairly large deer, which the locals, the local Algonquin speaking peoples are calling wapiti. And they're like, well, this is a very large deer. Not linguistically, our vocabulary tells us that a very large deer is an elk, ergo elk. So cool. Unfortunately, this is not the only very large deer on the North American continent. So as they push further and further into the North American continent, they start encountering even bigger deer that look like camels that have been run through some sort of terrifying machine. And then we get into kind of colonialism and language. And there's really the intersection between colonialism and language is something that cannot be discussed on a single, like there's too much to talk about on a single slide. This is a huge topic. But generally speaking, languages borrow from each other. In this case, the English-speaking settlers were trying for a bit, they were like, this is a brown elk and this is a gray elk. But these are two very different looking animals. It wasn't working very well. So they go to the Abenaki or the Algonquin speaking tribes, and the tribes are calling this animal a moose. And the tricky bit is that Algonquin, specifically these northeastern Algonquin dialects, are incredibly heavily inflected languages. So when we think about German, we think about inflected, like that's the language that people think of when they think of inflected languages, and that's actually not really correct. But an inflected language is where you can take a whole bunch of prefixes and suffixes and infixes and jam them onto your root to carry a whole bunch of semantic data. So in German, the example is when they crush words together and they're like, it is a giant Frankenwort. But with Abenaki or with the Algonquin languages and with many indigenous American languages, what happens is you can pack on all this semantic data. So you have the root, in this case, moose, but then you can have a plural, you can have a definite plural, you can add information about the possession of that animal, and these all take the form of suffixes. So, or there's a couple that are prefixes. So it got really confusing, I think, to people to try and figure out, this is a moose and this is a plural moose, because you're packing other information onto that word with the single versus plural sort of definition. So eventually people just sort of tossed their hands in the air and went, look, it's a moose. What are some other options? The Algonquin, depending on which Algonquin dialect you're talking about, Mosac is an option, or Mozac in Abenaki. Like I mentioned, this isn't really a good option because there's usually more data than just the AK suffix. So this is really a limited use option. Mooses was attempted. There's an example in one of John Adams' letters in the 1770s where he was writing, I believe, to his wife and talking about the various mooses that he encountered. Cool. No, nobody liked it. We didn't stick with it. Urban Dictionary says meese is correct. Meese is a back formation based on that goose pattern that we talked about at the beginning with the Germanic Umlaut. Urban Dictionary is a dumpster fire. Please do not listen to Urban Dictionary. Interestingly, there are examples in English where we have back-formed internal vowel mutations. So there's a couple of verbs that in Old English did not have that internal vowel mutation, but by the sort of late period of Middle English did. And it's because they sounded enough like some of the other verbs that had the mutation that people were like, well, clearly the right answer must be this. And that may eventually happen with the word moose, but it hasn't happened yet. And I'm not willing, this is I'm not willing to give up this fight. So certain individuals who are not in attendance on this thing, but maybe they're watching the live stream, certain individuals have suggested moosen or miesen. This appears to be, again, sort of a formation based on that German en ending, the plural suffix that appears on some German words, with a misapplied Germanic umlaut. These people are very wrong. They're very incorrect, and I don't know how to help them. This lecture was intended to sort of educate and assist those confused persons, but they didn't attend, or maybe they're watching the live stream. I don't know, but they're not in this room. Lame. Oop, that's another right button. So, resounding conclusion. This was a short presentation. You guys thought you're going to be here for like 3 hours. It's Sunday night. I'm not going to do that to you. So, real short conclusion. Some English words exhibit internal vowel mutation because of the Germanic umlaut. An example of such a word is goose. Goose sounds like moose. All the letters after the first one, identical. However, moose is a borrowing from another language, possibly even a calque from another language. Because of its late, no, a loanword. I did that wrong. Loanword is a calque. Calque is a loanword. Whatever, a borrowing. Possibly a borrowing from northeastern Algonquin. Because of its late addition, it did not go through that mutation in the 450-500 time frame. Instead, its plural is moose. It's just moose. Honestly, though, here's the thing. The thing that I have to admit is that languages, look, if you have successfully communicated something to somebody, congratulations, you've languaged. Good job. Well done. Language, it's a living thing that changes as its users change. Like I mentioned with some of the examples of the verbs that exhibit the internal mutation, that was the users changing it, as was the initial mutation, I suppose. But this was like a, maybe not conscious, but it was an acknowledgement of an existing pattern and an attempt to regularize the language. So theoretically, moose could go through that sort of attempt to regularize process. It's a thing that could happen in this world. I'm not thinking about that right now. It is okay. That is what language does. But seriously, for now, the plural of moose is moose.